Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere your high school history class never touched. No kings, no knights, no pyramids, no Rome. Just silence, soil, and bones. You're standing on a hillside. It's misty, cold, and eerily quiet. The trees barely sway, and the wind carries only the distant rustle of leaves. Like someone or something is trying not to be heard. Beneath your feet, just a few meters down, are dozens, no, hundreds of skeletons. Some missing their skulls, some twisted unnaturally, some still clutching each other. There's no monument, no names, just bones, and one haunting question. What happened here? As it turns out, your body knows more than your brain does, because this isn't just a local tragedy. This was global. You're alive today because one of your ancient male ancestors somehow, barely, survived. But 19 others like him, his brothers, cousins, uncles, fathers, did not. The genetic trail is shockingly clear. Something happened around 5,000 to 7,000 years ago that nearly wiped out all the men. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your local time and where you're watching from in the comments. It's oddly cozy knowing we're all drifting off together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the dew-wet grass of a modern European valley. But you're not in the present anymore. Not really. You're somewhere between now and never, chasing whispers from an age that didn't leave behind stone cities or golden crowns. Just silence. And a few scattered clues etched into your very bones. There's a strange comfort to the idea that your body is a library. Your genes are the footnotes, your chromosomes the curled, fragile parchment. And within them, scientists have found something deeply unsettling. Like a typo that repeats itself across every copy of a manuscript, a glaring anomaly shows up in the Y chromosome of almost every living man today. The Y chromosome, your tiny genetic post-it note of maleness, has been passed down from father to son for hundreds of generations. It's relatively unchanged. A quiet genetic ghost passed in whispers. But somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 years ago, those whispers nearly stopped. Almost all of them. The evidence comes from studies done on modern populations. Geneticists expected some diversity, some variation in the Y lines. After all, women from the same period left a broad and diverse mitochondrial trail. But the men? The male lineages hit a wall. It's called a bottleneck. A term that sounds harmless, like a traffic jam at a prehistoric roundabout. But what it really means is extinction. Brutal, sudden, terrifying loss. Almost every male lineage vanished in just a few generations. Historians still debate how to interpret it. Was it a pandemic? A climate collapse? Or something darker? Systematic killing? Whatever it was, it affected vast swaths of Africa, Europe, and Asia. This wasn't some localized tribal skirmish. It was a pattern. And here's the thing that keeps archaeologists and geneticists alike up at night. This event, this male extinction, left no clear trace in the written record, because writing didn't exist yet. Imagine that. The greatest demographic catastrophe ever to befall one half of the human population happened. And nobody wrote it down. No scribes, no chroniclers, no survivors with quill and ink. Only bloodlines that stopped. And yours, improbably, that didn't. That makes you a bit of a miracle. Or at least, statistically speaking, one very lucky guy. Or someone descended from one. Your Y line, your father's 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 father, and so on. Threads all the way back through that great disappearance. It ducked under whatever blade came swinging, sidestepped whatever mass death swept across the land, and made it through. 19 others standing beside him did not. Let that sink in for a moment. If time had rewound and spun out differently, you would not be here. You wouldn't have been born, wouldn't be lying here now listening to sleepy history ramble through your headphones. It's possible that your ancestor survived because he was in the right place at the right time. Or maybe, as some researchers speculate, because he was part of a victorious clan that destroyed all the others. Cheery, right? But that's where our journey begins, not with triumph or tragedy, but with a mystery, a void, an unexplained silence. The term genetic bottleneck might sound clinical, but it represents something deeply personal. It means your family tree once had hundreds of branches, and one day they were all chopped off. Except one. Yours. We know from other species that bottlenecks usually result from famine, disease, or natural disaster. But humans are a little different. We're not just at the mercy of nature. We're also at the mercy of each other. And there's a growing theory that this wasn't some accident of fate. It was intentional. A prehistoric purge. A war so complete it wiped out not only bodies, but bloodlines. What makes this even more unsettling is that it didn't happen everywhere at once. Some places, like certain isolated regions, seem to have avoided the full collapse. That suggests it wasn't a global environmental shift. It wasn't the Ice Age roaring back. It wasn't a plague carried on the wind. It was something more selective, more human. The idea of prehistoric war tends to conjure cartoon images, club-wielding cavemen grunting in loincloths. But this event, this was organized, repeated, catastrophic, and very real. The most jarring part of it all is how little it takes to erase a line. You don't need to kill every man. Just enough. The rest, nature finishes off. If the male population dips too low, it can't recover. Meanwhile, the women of that time, their genetic signatures persist. Broadly, peacefully, uninterrupted. So what happened to the men? That's what we're going to explore next. But for now, lie still. Let the fog roll in around your thoughts. Imagine a time before time, a world where no one kept records, but someone kept score. Not in ink or stone, but in who got to keep breathing. You're walking through the sterile quiet of a modern genetics lab now. White walls, blinking servers, the faint click-click of keyboards echoing like distant footsteps in a cave. Here, the past isn't uncovered with a shovel, but with data. Code. Strands of DNA mapped like stars in a prehistoric sky. Scientists peer into test tubes and computer screens, trying to reconstruct a mystery no one alive remembers. And what they find is not just strange, it's mathematically impossible to ignore. You may think of prehistory as a time of gradual change, slow migrations, peaceful evolution. But the Y chromosome disagrees. It tells a story of sudden, brutal collapse. A single, terrifying bottleneck. According to genomic studies, male genetic diversity across most of Eurasia and parts of Africa dropped by as much as 95% between 1000 and 7000 years ago. Let's put that in perspective. For every 20 distinct male lineages alive before this event, only one continued. 19 were erased without a trace. No artifacts, no written accounts, just statistical absence. Meanwhile, female lineages show no such collapse. Mitochondrial DNA, the kind you inherit from your mother, flows smoothly through this same period, which means women weren't disappearing, just men, and not just in one place. From Ireland to India, from Turkey to Tanzania, the same genetic signature shows up like a ghost fingerprint smudged across the continents. It's not an isolated event. It's not an accident. It's a pattern, a global one. Historians still argue whether this was truly simultaneous or whether it spread like a contagion, tribe by tribe, region by region, as the Neolithic world transformed. But there's no denying the signal is real. One study compared modern Y chromosome variants to that of the past, and concluded the decline was sharper than any war, plague, or famine in recorded history. Sharper even than the Black Death. This wasn't gradual attrition. This was annihilation. And here's the kicker. The rest of the genome didn't show this collapse. Only the Y chromosome was affected. It's like a perfectly functioning machine that suddenly loses one crucial wire, one thread of continuity. And nobody knows why. You can almost hear the Y chromosome protesting. Wait, where did everybody go? In response, researchers proposed several theories. Maybe male infanticide became rampant for some reason. Maybe some kind of cultural shift led to hyper-selective reproduction, where only the males of dominant clans were allowed to have children. Or maybe, and this is the theory gaining traction, it was war. A kind of systematic warfare that targeted male lineages. Not men, per se. Lineages. See, the Y chromosome doesn't shuffle like other genes. It passes almost unchanged from father to son. It's a straight line through time, which makes it easy to trace, and also easy to erase. If a group of men is wiped out in a generation, their Y line vanishes instantly. All it takes is one losing battle, or one ambush, or one village burned before sunrise. We know this kind of thing happens because it happened again much later. Genghis Khan is a great example. His lineage, identified by a specific Y chromosome marker, is found in millions of modern men. That's not legend. That's genetics. One man's male descendants spread so successfully that they left an actual dent in the genome. Now imagine the opposite. Instead of one man's line exploding outward, millions of other lines collapsing inward. Not because of success, but because of extermination. Scientists call this kind of population dip a genetic bottleneck, and the shape of the graph is chilling. You'd see a long, stable line of diversity, and then suddenly a plummet, like the floor dropping out. Then a slow recovery, with just a few surviving lines slowly multiplying again. That's what the Y chromosome shows us. You picture it like an hourglass. All that genetic sand flowing through a single narrow opening. One slim ancestor. One thin chance. And somehow your line made it through. There's a strange comfort in imagining that, isn't there? That you were meant to survive. That someone in your long, winding ancestral line ducked at the right time, or hid in the right cave, or simply got lucky. But maybe it wasn't luck. Maybe it was conquest. A newer theory, sometimes called the social selection hypothesis, suggests that prehistoric societies had already begun to favor certain elite males. Those who controlled land, food, or women. These men passed on their genes far more than others, often through multiple partners. And the rest? They faded away. Some scholars compare it to a prehistoric version of Game of Thrones, except instead of dragons, it's barley. Instead of thrones, it's irrigation ditches. And instead of political backstabbing, it's actual backstabbing. With stone axes. You laugh softly to yourself at the idea of Neolithic dating apps. Swipe left if your clan doesn't control water rights. But underneath the jokes, it's chilling. Because if a few clans gained power and then deliberately wiped out their rivals, they could change the entire genetic future of humanity. And maybe they did. This is the part where the data ends and the speculation begins. But the speculation is important, because it's trying to explain a question your bones have been asking for 7,000 years. Where did all the other men go? Maybe they died in combat. Maybe they were executed after surrender. Maybe they were sacrificed, enslaved, or simply forbidden to reproduce. We'll never know for sure. But what's undeniable is this. The genetic record shows they didn't come back. So now, as you lie here in the quiet dark, your Y chromosome humming quietly inside you like a dim flashlight passed through time, you're not just a sleeper. You're a survivor. One of the lucky 1/20th. You step out of the lab and back into the dirt. The digital graphs and glowing gene maps fade, replaced by wind-chilled air and soft, muddy ground. Because while the DNA tells you something happened, it doesn't tell you what. Not exactly. For that you'll need to get your hands dirty. The truth is buried. Literally. Beneath your boots, under layers of loam and clay, lie the physical remnants of lives abruptly ended. Not just a few isolated skeletons, but entire communities laid to rest, not with ceremony, but with haste. Piled, broken, silenced. The archaeologists call them mass graves. You might be imagining some kind of war-torn battlefield. Swords, armor, arrows stuck in rib cages. But this isn't medieval warfare. These are prehistoric horrors. No iron, no bronze, no banners waving. Just stone, bone, and silence. You walk into the past, into sites like Talheim, Schletz, and Herxheim. These names sound ordinary now. Towns in quiet corners of Germany and Austria. But their soil tells a darker story. A story of systematic killing so ancient that not even myth dared preserve it. The site at Talheim was the first major clue. Discovered in 1983, this unassuming field revealed a pit containing 34 human skeletons. Men, women, and children. All of them brutally killed. Skulls shattered, bones broken, many showing injuries only to their backs and sides. Defensive wounds? None. These people weren't fighting. They were running. Historians still argue whether the victims were fleeing an ambush, trying to protect their children, or simply caught unaware. But what's clear is that they weren't soldiers. They were villagers, families, and they died together. The bodies were dumped hastily, overlapping, like trash. No attempt to separate the old from the young, the women from the men. Just a communal grave, dug deep and filled quickly. One stone tool, one swing, one life. Again and again. You shift your focus to Schletz, where things get even worse. This site, unearthed in eastern Austria, contained the remains of up to 200 people. Many were decapitated, skulls removed, limbs scattered. And again, little sign of a defensive struggle. The attackers weren't repelled. They weren't even resisted. Who were these attackers? That's part of the mystery. The dead and the killers left behind the same tools, the same pottery, the same style of houses. They weren't outsiders. They were neighbors, perhaps even cousins. The idea that these events could have been the result of internal conflict, tribal violence, revenge, or conquest is chilling. These weren't foreign invaders. These were people who shared language, dress, diet. They fought and killed not for glory or gods, but for land. Or maybe for water. Or maybe just because they could. Then there's Herxian, the most disturbing sight of all. You crouch near what used to be a Neolithic settlement, where archaeologists have unearthed the remains of over 1,000 individuals. That number alone is staggering for such an early period. But it's the condition of the bodies that sears the imagination. Skulls were smashed post-mortem. Bones dismembered with ritual-like precision. And, perhaps most hauntingly, many of the remains show signs of burning, scraping, and breakage consistent with cannibalism. That's right, cannibalism. Not just survival cannibalism in times of famine, but something ceremonial, repeated, structured. Herxheimer might have been a death cult center, a place where enemies, possibly even their own people, were killed and processed as part of some religious or social ritual. Some theories suggest that Herxheim wasn't just a mass grave, it was a killing site, used for years, a place where bodies were brought from afar for this grim purpose. You picture the village, low wooden structures, the smell of smoke and drying grain in the air, and beneath it all, pits, dozens of them, carefully dug, carefully filled, with skulls stacked like trophies, arms and legs broken like kindling. Historians are still uncertain. Were these acts of war, religious offerings, population control, a chilling combination of all three? One fringe theory even proposes that this was a form of territorial intimidation, a way of saying, enter our land, and this is your future. Not with walls or weapons, but with bone arrangements. You lie back now and look up at a cloudy sky. No stars tonight, just grey. But you can imagine what it was like back then. No cities, no writing, just groups of humans surviving on thin harvests and tight space, driven by hunger, fear, and the need to secure just a little more land. Just one more field, one more stream, one more woman. The earliest violence in human history didn't wear armor. It wore skins and carried stone axes. It didn't record victory. It left no names at all. Just bones in pits, preserved only because no one bothered to bury them with dignity. And here's the strange part. These weren't just chaotic killings. They were methodical. The children weren't spared. The elderly weren't respected. The women were often spared, yes. But we'll get to that. What matters now is that the archaeological evidence matches the genetic one. Both speak of loss. Sudden, sweeping, male-targeted loss. It's one thing to read about this in textbooks. It's another to imagine a real human. A father, maybe, clutching his son's hand and running barefoot through morning mist, only to fall face first into wet soil before the blow lands. These were people. Living lives. Making tools. Grinding grain. Laughing. Sleeping. And then gone. No stone markers. No final words. No memory. Except in you. You sit now beside one of those silent tombs, the earth cool against your skin, the air still. The pit is filled in, the bones long removed and catalogued in museum basements. But the feeling remains. A weight not just of death, but of something deeper. A question that scratches beneath the surface of everything we know. Why? Why did they do it? Why did our ancestors, who had already survived ice ages and saber-toothed cats, suddenly turn on one another with such calculated violence? Why this sharp shift from survival to slaughter, from kinship to conquest? To begin to answer, you have to go even further back. Back to a time when no one owned anything, because ownership hadn't been invented yet. For tens of thousands of years, humans lived as foragers. Small, mobile bands that moved with the seasons, eating berries and bugs and whatever they could catch. They didn't stay in one place long enough to build fences, and without fences, you can't have property. And without property, what's there to fight over? But then something changed. The agricultural revolution. Around 10,000 years ago, humans began to domesticate plants and animals. First in the Fertile Crescent, then spreading across Europe, Asia, and beyond. Wild wheat became tidy rows of grain. Hunters became farmers. Wandering gave way to staying put. And when people stayed put, they started to think differently. Land became life. Not just spiritually, but literally. A good plot of earth meant food, survival, and, eventually, status. You couldn't just wander off and find another meal. You had to guard what you'd grown, and to guard it, you needed rules. Boundaries. Muscle. You needed control. Historians still debate whether this shift was gradual or explosive, whether it took centuries or just a few generations. But one thing is clear. Agriculture didn't just change what people ate. It changed how they lived. And more importantly, how they killed. You imagine two neighboring clans. One prospers. Bigger harvest, healthier animals. The other struggles. Bad soil, late rains. Maybe a failed crop. There's no supermarket to fill the gap. There's only the neighbor's grain. And maybe his daughter. And if you want either, you'll have to take them. This is the dawn of territorial warfare. Not over religion or revenge, but over calories, over soil, over the right to exist. And the strange thing? It wasn't even personal. These people didn't hate each other. They may have traded last year. They may even have shared rituals. But this year, one of them was weaker. And weakness in this new world meant death. The rise of agriculture made violence scalable. You didn't just kill to survive. You killed to expand. And once you saw the benefit of taking, not just food, but people, you couldn't unsee it. You began to plan for it. You didn't just attack. You prepared, trained, watched the moon, waited for dawn. This wasn't chaos. This was strategy. And the victims, often entire clans, not random groups of strangers, but organized familial units. Wipe out the men, and you don't just eliminate enemies, you erase their legacy, their claim to land, their future. It's easier than it sounds. One bad year, one ambush, and a whole lineage vanishes. You start to see how quickly it could escalate. A cycle. One group attacks. The survivors retaliate. The next year, more death. The next, even more. Until everyone begins to believe that survival depends not on tolerance, but on preemption. Better to strike first than be dug up last. The archaeological record begins to reflect this tension. Defensive ditches, settlements built on hills, tools designed for killing, not farming. The axes found in many Neolithic graves weren't used for chopping trees, and the graves themselves, they get bigger. It wasn't just about taking food anymore, it was about removing competition in the most final sense. One eerie detail. Many of these graves lack older males, not because they were spared, but because they may never have reached old age. Life expectancy for men in some of these communities may have been brutally short. You didn't get to be an elder unless you were lucky, or lethal. You glance again at the broken skeletons from Talheim. None of them had lived past their 30s. Historians still argue whether these were true wars by modern standards, or simply raids that escalated beyond control. But when you see hundreds of bodies, many killed in similar ways, buried together with no sign of burial rites, you don't think isolated incident. You think policy. The social shift went deeper than violence. It altered beliefs, rituals, and family structures. Where once people had shared broadly across groups, now they passed things down within them. Land, tools, names, and power. Especially through the male line. And as we'll see later, when power passes through men, removing men becomes a frighteningly effective strategy. So the seeds were planted, literally, in those neat little rows of grain that seemed like progress, in every fence and border and rule, in every granary guarded by flint blades. Agriculture brought stability, yes, but also hierarchy, greed, and genocide. You lie still, listening to the quiet sound of soil shifting beneath imaginary feet. You imagine a lone survivor, barefoot, dirty, crouched in the brush, watching his village burn. He's the one who ran faster, hid better, lived. Maybe he's your ancestor, and the others, the slower ones, the loud ones, the unlucky ones, they became part of the ground. You breathe out. You're just a tourist here, in the long echo of history's most overlooked turning point. But if you'd been born 7,000 years ago, you wouldn't be watching history unfold. You'd be part of it. You wake up somewhere older than memory, sitting cross-legged in the cool dust of a forgotten clearing. The air is still, thick with the scent of smoke and wet grass. A dozen figures surround a fire. Men, gaunt and quiet, sharpening stone blades. Their eyes flicker to the horizon, not for prey, but for people. Something's shifted, something deep in the way humans think about one another. You notice the fire is surrounded by men only. No women, no children, just fathers, sons, brothers. And they're planning something. A raid, a defense. It's hard to say. But the conversation isn't about food. It's about them, the others, the neighbors, the rival clan across the trees. You realize this isn't hunting anymore. It's something far colder. Because now we enter the part of the story where women become a central reason, not just for survival, but for slaughter. Up to this point, most hunter-gatherer groups had relatively fluid social structures. Both men and women could hold influence, and marriages were often used to create bonds between different bands. But as agriculture took root, so did a new kind of order, patrilineal society, where descent and inheritance passed through the male line. Land didn't just belong to families anymore, it belonged to clans. And within these clans, men controlled land. Men passed on names. Men determined who got to stay, who got to eat, and who got to leave. Women, suddenly, were no longer co-survivors. They became something else, reproductive vessels for rival lineages. Or worse, bargaining chips in an unending cycle of tribal calculus. Historians still debate whether this shift toward male dominance happened rapidly or evolved slowly alongside agriculture. But the result is clear. Women's roles were increasingly confined to producing children, especially male children who could inherit and defend the land. And this had horrifying consequences. Imagine you're part of a small tribe struggling to survive. You've just lost half your food supply to drought. Your neighbor clan has better farmland, more animals, and more women. You have two choices. Hope your children don't starve next winter, or do something about it. In this new system, there's a brutally efficient solution. Kill the men. Take the women. You wouldn't need to be a genius to see the logic. The men are threats. They guard the land. They pass down the name. They resist. But the women? If you spare them, you gain not just labor, but the ability to grow your clan, your children, your lineage, your name. That's the key. Lineage. The Y chromosome doesn't lie. If a man's descendants are killed before they can reproduce, his line vanishes forever. But if his wife is taken and impregnated by her captor, the captor's Y line spreads. This wasn't just about violence, it was about legacy. And so began a new kind of war. A war of erasure. Not to enslave or convert, but to delete. To eliminate an entire bloodline and overwrite it with your own. There's chilling evidence for this in modern genetics. Remember that bottleneck? The one that left only a handful of male lines standing? One theory suggests that it wasn't random at all, but the result of selective male extinction paired with the integration of surviving women. In other words, the women were allowed to live. The men were not. Some scholars refer to this as patrilineal wipeout, a form of targeted demographic warfare. It's a mouthful, but the idea is simple. In a world where lineage is power, the fastest way to grow your own influence is to destroy someone else's root and graft the remaining branches onto your own. Gruesome, isn't it? And yet, disturbingly efficient. It explains why female genetic diversity remains relatively stable across this time period, while male diversity drops off a cliff. It also explains why, in many archaeological sites, female remains are often fewer among the dead, or show signs of continued life elsewhere, migrating, perhaps unwillingly, to new settlements. You lie back, trying to imagine what that looked like. A village burned, the men dead, the women herded, silent to a new home, given new names, bearing new children, their old lives erased like chalk in the rain. Historians still argue whether the women were spared out of mercy, strategy, or simple biological utility. Probably a mix of all three. But what's clear is that their survival did not mean peace. It meant assimilation. It meant bearing sons not for the men they chose, but for the ones who held the blades. Some fringe theories go even further, suggesting that early clans developed rituals around this process. Ceremonies to legitimize captured women, stories to justify conquest, myths to sanctify stolen wives, the creation of identity from violence. We wonder how many of those myths still echo in modern culture, buried under newer names. You shift in the grass and think about how quiet the world must have been then. No cities, no traffic, just wind, birds, and footsteps in the dark. And yet, beneath that silence, entire histories were being rewritten, not in ink, not on tablets, but in wombs, in genetics, in what was passed down, and what was permanently erased. It's uncomfortable to think about, That your existence may be the product of one man's survival and 19 others' extermination. That somewhere in your ancestral tree is a fork where someone was spared and someone else wasn't. That behind every living lineage is a shadow of the ones that didn't make it. You close your eyes and let that weight settle. This isn't guilt. It isn't pride. It's just gravity. The heavy pull of history. The kind written in blood, not books. You breathe out and listen to the fire crackle in your mind, surrounded by men planning their next move. Not for glory, not for gold, but for women, for land, for names that would never be forgotten, because they left none left to remember anything else. You're crouched now on the edge of a Neolithic village, just beyond the torchlight, your breath slow and shallow. You're watching, not because you want to, but because your life might depend on understanding what's about to happen. The huts are quiet. Chickens, if they even have those yet, are silent. There's no celebration, no feast, just men. Men sharpening stones, tying ropes, whispering strategy. You recognize the look. They're not preparing for a hunt. They're preparing for eradication. This is the moment when violence stops being a reaction and becomes a tool for shaping the future, not by conquering territory, but by deleting rivals from the timeline. This is the rise of the patrilineal clan. You might think of clans as cozy, groups of extended family, warm fires, good storytelling. But these early kinship groups were deadly serious institutions. The kind of clan that emerged in the post-agriculture world was something new, a father-to-son machine. One that didn't just value strength, it preserved it by passing land, status and identity exclusively through males. And that meant every other male was a threat. Historians still argue about when exactly patrilineal descent became dominant over matrilineal or bilateral models. But around 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, something snapped into place. You were who your father was. And if he lost everything, including his life, you weren't just an orphan. You were nothing. Now imagine you're part of a clan built on that belief. Your power comes from how many sons you have. Your safety depends on whether your rivals still have theirs. And the simplest way to protect your own name? Erase the others. Not just by fighting, but by finishing the job. You don't let their boys grow up. You don't risk them coming back 10 years later for revenge. You don't leave any seeds behind that might sprout another generation of enemies. You cut the branch clean, then burn the stump. And here's the unsettling part. The logic worked. You walk back through the genetic record and see it plain as daylight. The sharp drop in male lineages wasn't slow. It was like a light switch. One moment, diversity. The next, monopoly. A few dominant Y chromosome lines explode across the map, while all the others flatline into oblivion. This isn't natural drift. It's not the result of a peaceful demographic shift. It's a statistical kill zone. And it suggests something horrifyingly effective, that early humans learned how to dominate time itself by taking not just land, but the future. You picture it like a family tree. Dozens of branches growing outward from a common ancestor. Then suddenly, 19 of 20 are snapped off at once. Only one is allowed to keep growing. Yours. Some researchers call it reproductive skew, where a small number of males produce the majority of offspring. You see this in other species too. Elephant seals, for example, where one dominant male might father dozens of pups, while others get nothing. But elephant seals aren't building houses. They aren't inventing gods. They aren't marching into neighboring camps and making strategic decisions about bloodlines. Your ancestors were. It's even possible that this reproductive imbalance wasn't just a side effect of warfare, but its goal. Because once patrilineal power became law, conquest wasn't enough. You had to rewrite the family tree. Let's say your clan takes a village. You could integrate them. Let their sons live. Trade, intermarry, absorb. Or you could do what history suggests they often did. Spare only the women. Kill every man and boy. And raise children with your name, your story, your inheritance. That's not just domination. That's identity theft on a generational scale. Some modern tribal societies, like the Yanomami in South America or certain Papuan highland groups, have shown similar patterns. Inter-village raiding, male-focused violence, and women integrated as captives or brides. Anthropologists have long debated whether such behaviors are cultural anomalies or echoes of something deeper, something older. You exhale and feel a cold wind creep past your cheek. It's not guilt. You didn't do any of this. But you're alive because someone did. Somewhere back in that ancient world, your bloodline was spared. Not because it deserved it, but because it was efficient. Because your ancestors weren't just survivors. They were strategists. You wonder if they felt anything as they made their decisions. Did they hesitate? Did they mourn the boys they killed? Did they see them as threats, as symbols? Or did they stop seeing them as people at all? We'll never know, because those voices didn't make it to the present. Just bones and your DNA. You blink slowly and imagine a dark hut on a cold night, where a single father tells his son, they must never come back. Not out of hatred, but certainty, because his own father told him the same. The clan system had no room for mercy. It had no concept of enemy children, only future threats. The fewer surviving sons, the more secure your claim. The fewer rival names whispered, the louder yours echoed. You lie still now, the fire of that ancient clan fading into embers in your mind. But its warmth lingers, not because it was kind, but because it was successful. You are the echo of a strategy, a survivor of a plan, a branch that kept growing not by luck, but by elimination. And that realization sits heavy, but it also whispers, you're here, you made it. Your line endured when others didn't. And the price of that endurance is all around you, in the silent names that never made it to the family tree. You're walking now through a long, shadowy corridor, not one built of stone or wood, but of absences. Names not carved, songs not sung. It's a tunnel of forgetting, and it stretches back farther than any monument can reach. You're looking for the 19. 19 men out of every 20, gone. Vanished from the record, erased from memory. Not because they did something wrong, but because they were on the losing side of a prehistoric system that didn't keep score in ink or oral legend. It kept score in children. This section of the story isn't about what was done to them, but what wasn't done for them. No poems, no myth, no memory. Because when a male line ends, it ends completely. You see, women in prehistory might be carried into a new group, absorbed, renamed, their children folded into the dominant line. But men, once a Y line stops, there's no backup, no cultural continuation. Their stories, tools, and faces vanish with them. You feel it now, the full weight of total deletion. This wasn't just death. This was silence. Erasure so complete that, had we not discovered it in our DNA thousands of years later, we never would have known anything happened at all. It's like a fire that burns so clean it leaves no ash. Even Talheim, Schletz, and Herxheim, the only places where the massacre left physical evidence, represent just the tiniest sliver. For every site we found, there are likely hundreds more buried, trampled, paved over, lost to rivers and roots. The 19 are underfoot, always just below the surface, but never quite visible. Historians still argue whether oral traditions might contain fragments of these events, distorted through time. Some think certain mythic floods, plagues or purges might actually refer to these ancient male extinctions in symbolic form. But no one knows for sure. What we do know is that there's an absence of mourning, no mass graves with ceremonial items, no offerings, no evidence that these men were grieved. Instead, the burials we do find are quick, careless, shallow. Bones scattered, heads missing, limbs removed. Not even the dignity of order, just raw disposal. It makes you wonder, were the killers trying to erase more than bodies? Were they trying to erase identity? You lie back and imagine a fire-lit ceremony in one of the surviving clans, perhaps the victors of Herxheim, telling stories of their founding hero, of how their ancestors conquered the valley, took the land, absorbed the women, and burned everything else. The children sit silently, listening, but none of them know what was lost. None of them know the names of the men who once stood here, men who may have laughed, danced, carved tools, told their own stories. They're just gone, not even ghosts. There's something almost cruel about it, not the violence, which is horrific enough, but the forgetting. The way time collaborates with conquest. The way history often obeys the winners, no matter how brutal. Because remember, the only reason we even suspect this happened is thanks to gene sequencing. The archaeological record, by itself, can't tell us about vanished bloodlines. Skeletons don't hold banners that say, "We used to be a people." They just lie still, waiting to be noticed. And they weren't noticed. Not for thousands of years. Until one day, a scientist studying human Y chromosomes noticed something odd. A massive drop-off in diversity. A cliff in the data. As if someone had pressed delete across an entire layer of the male population. The 19 didn't just die. They were edited out. Not by intention, perhaps. Not in the way modern censorship works. But through the relentless logic of pre-modern survival. If your children don't live, your story doesn't either. You may wonder why this matters now. Why dwell on people who didn't leave ruins, or paintings, or epic tales? Because they did leave something. You. Not directly, perhaps, but through contrast. Through the narrow chance your line made it when theirs didn't. Your very existence is a living counterpoint to 19 others who aren't. That's not guilt. It's context. You are the one path that wasn't cut short. And now, thousands of years later, in the dark quiet of your room, you're thinking about them. The unremembered, the unmarked, the unlucky. And in that small act of reflection, you give them the closest thing to resurrection they're likely to receive. Memory. Even if it's imagined, even if it's soft and sleepy and fading like a dream. You see flashes in your mind now. A hand holding a flint blade. A boy being led away into the forest. A woman staring at the sky, trying to count stars that refuse to hold meaning anymore. These people weren't myths. They weren't kings or heroes or villains. They were just people, trying to live, trying to eat, trying to keep their name alive. And they failed. Or rather, they were made to fail. Not by their own hands, but by a system that favored total conquest over coexistence. A world in which legacy mattered more than life. And in that world, mercy was a liability. So the 19 became dust. And your ancestor, whoever he was, didn't. Maybe he was ruthless. Maybe he was clever. Maybe he was just very, very quiet. But he lived. And now you do too. So lie still. Breathe. You're carrying more than just DNA. You're carrying a ghost story with no ending. A narrative made of absences. A history that lives in the space between facts. The silence you hear now, it's theirs. You wake to a strange sound, the rhythmic scratching of wooden rakes over dry earth. All around you, a sea of bent backs and blistered hands. People working the fields, their bodies burned by sun, their fingers stained by soil. There's no chatter, no music, just effort, repetition, survival. This isn't war, but it feels like one, because this is the battlefield of the Neolithic. Forget castles and armies. The true revolution that reshaped the world was wheat, barley, millet. Small, unimpressive grains that turned mobile hunter-gatherers into sedentary property owners, and in doing so, changed everything about how people lived, thought, and died. You walk slowly through the fields. Not lush farmland, but harsh, stubborn terrain coaxed into cooperation with back-breaking labor. Farming wasn't freedom. It was obligation. A daily gamble against weather, insects, and starvation. And yet, it promised one thing hunting never could. Accumulation. Suddenly, you could store food. You could own land. And if you could store and own, you could protect. And if you could protect, you could compete. Historians still argue whether agriculture made humans happier or simply busier. But one thing's clear, it made them territorial. And with territory came tension. At first, this meant the occasional dispute. A stolen sheep, a broken boundary marker. But it didn't take long for those disputes to escalate into violence. Not because humans became crueler overnight, but because the stakes were higher. You weren't just losing a meal anymore. You were losing next season. And if your neighbor had better land, better harvest, a wider irrigation ditch, that wasn't just luck. That was a threat to your children. So you pick up a stick, then a blade, then a stone axe. You know what's at risk. In this new world of crops and granaries, survival didn't depend on foraging skill. It depended on who could hold what, and for how long. Suddenly, the wealth gap wasn't just visible. It was weaponized. And the growing inequality wasn't just between individuals. It was between groups, clans, tribes, entire villages with different soil, different rainfall, different luck. You could tolerate your neighbors before, when you all followed the same herds. But now they've dammed the stream. Now they've fenced the good land. Now they've traded for obsidian tools while you're still using dull flint. Now they're a problem. And so the crops, those symbols of civilization, start to cast long shadows. Behind every successful harvest is a man watching his border. Behind every full granary, a clan whispering about how to keep it full, or how to take someone else's. You pass through a Neolithic village, no larger than a football field, but with walls built from thick timber and earth, defensive ditches, watch posts, signs of sustained fear. This wasn't a one-time raid response. This was architecture born from anxiety. Because the agricultural revolution didn't just give us surplus food, it gave us insecurity. You couldn't move on when the land soured. You were anchored, bound, invested. And once your roots were in the soil, you had to guard them like your life depended on it. Because it did. You picture two clans meeting at dawn, not with greetings, but with warnings, not with offerings, but with weapons. Because in a world where land means life, compromise feels like suicide. And the women? Still part of the calculus. Now even more than before. As land became lineage, women became the vessels for transmission. Not just of babies, but of claims. Inheritance, legitimacy. You couldn't afford to let rival women birth rival sons. And you couldn't let rival men claim your women. Suddenly, every field, every hut, every person became a marker of identity. You were no longer just human. You were us. And everyone else was them. And them was dangerous. Historians call this the rise of bounded identity, a shift where individuals began to define themselves not just by kin, but by exclusive belonging. You weren't just part of a band. You were part of a group that must survive, even if others didn't. And so the stakes climbed. Kill a man in a hunting dispute? That's personal. Wipe out a rival clan's men so they don't contest your farmland again? That's practical. That's future-proofing. You watch as a young man digs an irrigation trench, sweat soaking through his tunic. He doesn't know war is coming. He just wants to water his barley. But across the ridge, another group sees his progress and wonders what he'll try to control next year. And so the seeds of suspicion sprout long before the crops. Even today, we underestimate how quickly agriculture divided us. We imagine early farmers as peaceful folk in linen tunics, tending pumpkins and smiling at the sun. But dig a little deeper, literally, and you find something else. Weapon caches, wound patterns, walls. The roots of food are soaked in fear. You lie flat now in the tall grass, invisible, as the distant sound of argument begins. Two groups, two claims, one stream. The sun is rising, and it might be the last time it does for someone. And you realize this isn't just about food. It never was. It's about the structure agriculture created, the illusion of permanence, the pressure of ownership, the trap of inheritance. The soil binds you, the fence defines you, and when the fence is threatened, the blade follows. You're not even halfway through the Neolithic day, but you already feel the weight of centuries pressing down. The sun creeps higher above the horizon, casting long shadows behind freshly tilled fields, behind stone huts and stacked grain, behind men who no longer see each other as human first, but as rivals, obstacles, targets. And now we get to the uncomfortable part. The part where women stop being people in the eyes of early society and start becoming something far more dangerous. Resources. You hear it whispered first around the edge of a smouldering fire, low voices, bitter with envy. Their clan has more women. Their sons will be strong. They'll outgrow us. Because in this new world, where power flows through the father, women become the bottleneck to male power. One man can father many children. A woman can only bear one at a time, maybe a few across the years. Which means if your clan wants to grow fast, wants to thrive, wants to ensure its bloodline dominates the next generation, you need women, and lots of them. Historians still argue about how deliberate this thinking was. Did prehistoric people sit around sketching reproductive math in the dirt? Probably not. But the logic wasn't lost on them. If your village has 10 women and your rival's village has 15, guess what? They win. Not today. Maybe not even this year. But in 2 decades, their sons will outnumber yours. And sons carry land. Sons carry names. Sons guard fields. Sons go to war. This is the dawn of reproductive warfare. You're not just killing to remove threats anymore. You're acquiring wombs. You're shaping your legacy not with tools or treaties, but with uteruses. You win by outbreeding. You outbreed by outnumbering. You outnumber by absorbing. And you absorb by taking. You walk along the edge of a raided settlement now. The huts still smoulder. The fields are trampled. The men, those who tried to resist, lie in heaps. Some still clutching stones. Others face down in the dirt. But the women, they're missing. Not buried. Not burned. Just gone. Taken. Not because they were loved, but because they were needed. You start to see the full horror of the system that formed. Villages began to plan for this. Young warriors raised with the expectation that someday they might raid and bring back wives. The older men instructing them not just on battle tactics, but on claiming. On how to integrate a captive into the household, on how to erase her former identity and replace it with the clan's. Historians find echoes of this even in much later, historic societies, from the rape of the Sabian women in Roman myth to Viking practices of forced assimilation. But here, in the Neolithic murk, it's raw, recent, and terrifying. One fringe theory even suggests that some tribes began to ritualize the process, turning capture into marriage, violence into custom. Imagine a harvest festival that doubles as a celebration of new wives. No one talks about where they came from, just that the tribe is growing, and that means safety and prestige. Because women weren't just vessels for children, they were political assets. Proof that your raid succeeded, that your clan is rising, that your name will echo louder in the bones of future generations. You lie down in a cold hut, listening to the fire crackle, and wonder what it felt like to be one of those women. Taken, renamed, assigned a husband. Maybe not beaten. After all, they needed you healthy, but never free. You bore sons not for yourself, but for the people who destroyed your home. And the worst part? There was no return, no rescue. The idea of going back didn't exist. Once you were claimed, your past was erased. You were someone new, whether you liked it or not. Anthropologists studying patterns of ancient female migration have noticed something strange. Women moved a lot more than men. Their mitochondrial DNA is scattered across regions, while the Y chromosome tends to cluster. That suggests patriarchality. Women leave, men stay. A model that favors male dominance, territorial inheritance, and reproductive control. All very tidy, all very efficient, all very bleak. You roll onto your side and imagine 2 young boys raised side by side, both born in the same village. But one is the biological son of the tribe's leader, his bloodline pure, his status secure. The other, born of a captured woman. Technically part of the clan now, but always slightly apart. Different. A living reminder of a raid, of a life lost, of a war won. What happens when those boys grow up? Will one lead while the other serves? Or will that difference, small at first, grow into resentment? Rivalry. Repetition. The system was never stable. That's the thing. It worked. Until it didn't. Until jealousy boiled. Until wives became bargaining chips. Until alliances frayed. Until one tribe grew faster than its neighbors and the whole cycle began again. Kill. Take. Breed. Expand. And in this cold math of survival, women were always the most prized variable. Not for their voice or their choice, but for their capacity. Not all groups were the same, of course. Some resisted this model. Others practiced more egalitarian traditions, now buried under the dominance of their more aggressive neighbors. Cultures that died not in battle, but in bed. Outbred, overwritten, forgotten. You close your eyes and hear the sound of two mothers singing lullabies in different languages just over the rich. One's language will survive, the other will fade, and no one will remember which one mattered more, because the future only listens to the loudest voice. And the voice that survives gets to pretend it was always right. You're standing now at the base of a crooked tree. Its trunk is thick, gnarled, knotted with age. But look closer, and you'll see something strange. This tree only has a few strong branches. The rest, snapped off, missing, as if something long ago decided which directions were allowed to grow. That tree is your patriline. Your father's 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 father's, and so on, unbroken all the way back through the ancient fog of time. A single thin thread that somehow survived when all the others were violently severed. And in this moment, you realized just how deliberate that pruning was. Because in the age of patrilineal clans, to end a man's line was to kill him twice. It wasn't enough to strike him down. His name had to be removed, his children erased, his Y chromosome stopped in its tracks. That was the real victory. This is the era when descent through the male line became everything. Land, power, status, identity. All of it flowed from father to son like a river through the hills. And once that river dried up, nothing could bring it back. So rival clans developed strategies, not just to win a fight, but to end a future. Historians still debate whether this kind of warfare was conscious and coordinated, or just a brutal consequence of how kinship worked. But the outcome was the same. Over time, groups learned that you didn't need to conquer land if you could eliminate the bloodline that claimed it. And here's the terrifying logic. The fewer surviving male lines in the region, the greater the reproductive monopoly of the victors. You imagine this in action. One tribe descends upon another. The men are slaughtered, not for their crimes, but for their chromosomes. The women are taken, not for love, but for lineage. And the children born afterward. They don't bear the names of the dead. They carry the Y chromosomes of the victors. It's genetic warfare. Long before anyone knew what a gene was. You sit down in a hut, bare, quiet, the fire low. A man, your hypothetical ancestor, sharpens a blade, not because he wants to fight, but because he has to. He's heard the stories. The clans nearby are growing. Their sons are numerous. Their fields are wider. He's not defending his life. He's defending his continuity. And that's what this all comes down to. Continuity. The archaeological record starts to show more and more signs of this strategy. Settlement layers that end abruptly. Clusters of adult male skeletons killed at the same time. Child remains missing altogether, suggesting they were taken, absorbed, or replaced. In some sites, like those at Herxheim or Schöneck-Kilianstätten, entire generations appear to vanish overnight. Gone from the bones, gone from the genes, gone. And the survivors. Their lineages multiply, their genetic footprints deepen. In modern Y chromosome studies, we see the fingerprints of these survivors everywhere. Vast swaths of men across Eurasia descending from just a handful of male ancestors. The names are long forgotten, of course, but their Y markers remain, like flags on the hilltops of history. You lie back and picture a map, not of land, but of male descent. Lines branching outward from a few lone survivors, while hundreds of other lines trail off into silence. And every sharp turn in the graph, that's a blade, a raid, a night no one remembered to tell their children about. But you're here, so your line must have been one of the lucky ones, or one of the ruthless ones. It's hard to say. Some fringe scholars go even further, suggesting that early clans didn't just accept this system, they institutionalized it. That rights, rules and taboos were built around ensuring patrilineal purity. That outsiders were seen as threats not because they were foreign, but because their sons would compete with yours. Imagine that paranoia baked into every custom, every festival, every marriage. The goal wasn't peace. It was preservation of the Y. You think back to that tree, the one with the broken branches. The victors didn't just let their own line grow. They cut away all the others. That's the world your earliest ancestors built. It wasn't fair. It wasn't kind. But it was effective, and it worked so well, so thoroughly, that today, thousands of years later, most of the men you pass on the street share ancestry with only a small handful of Neolithic survivors. Let that settle. You and the stranger beside you may have had entirely different lives. But genetically, there's a decent chance you share a common male ancestor not too far back in the distant fog. Maybe you both come from the same tribe that outlived a massacre, or the same clan that committed one. You'll never know. The lines have blurred, the names have long since disappeared, but the Y is patient. It remembers. So as you fall back into the stillness of the present, you realize something simple but strange. You were chosen, not in a divine sense, not by fate, but by a ruthless process that rewarded one kind of success: survival of the patriline. And everything you are, every thought, every dream, every tired breath you exhale tonight, traces back to that one narrow thread, that one branch no one bothered to cut. The grass shifts under your feet as you walk across a field that hasn't seen a battle in 7,000 years. There's no blood here now, no smoke, no shouting. Just the quiet rustle of wind through stalks of barley, and the echo of a question still waiting for an answer. Where did the men go? You already know part of it. You've seen the graves. You've felt the chill of selective silence, of Y lines cut like rope. But now you want specifics. How many were lost? Where exactly did this erasure take place? Was it everywhere at once, or did it creep like a shadow across the ancient world? To answer that, you have to zoom out. The Y chromosome bottleneck, as it's sometimes called, didn't happen in just one place. It wasn't limited to a single tribe, or even a single region. It was widespread, covering enormous swaths of Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa, and the numbers don't lie. Genetic studies show that prior to about 7,000 years ago, there was a broad diversity of Y chromosome lineages among early human males. But then, suddenly, across multiple continents, that diversity collapsed. Almost all of those male lines vanished, leaving only a few dominant ones to carry on. You might expect this kind of collapse to show up during a catastrophic event, like a supervolcano or an ice age. But no such event aligns with this timeline. Climate was relatively stable. Populations were growing. The Neolithic world was expanding. And yet, the men disappeared. The timing lines up almost too perfectly with the rise of complex farming societies and increasing social stratification. The more land was owned, the more territory had to be defended. And the more that depended on male inheritance, the more targeted the killings became. Some scholars have described this period as a prehistoric male purge, not in the sense of one organized conspiracy, but as a repeatable pattern that emerged across distant cultures who independently figured out the same terrible trick. You don't need to kill everyone, just the men, just the fathers and sons. Kill them, and you kill the name, the claim, the threat. You glance at a modern map now, your mind overlaying it with ancient migrations and mass disappearances. In Central Europe, we see the spread of Y haplogroups like R1b, a lineage that now dominates, but was once a minority. After the Bottleneck, it explodes across the continent, as if the world suddenly belonged to its carriers. In South Asia, a similar story unfolds. The R1a haplogroup, now common in northern India, shows signs of a rapid expansion from just a few male ancestors. Again, shortly after the Bottleneck window. Even in sub-Saharan Africa, studies have found a sharp drop in male line diversity around this same time period, suggesting that the phenomenon wasn't confined to one environment, one culture, or one weapon. It was something about how humans had begun to organize themselves, and in that organization, some lines grew, while others were cut out. You sit beside a slow-moving stream, letting the ripples mirror the branching paths of ancestry. One pebble tossed in can send ripples outward for centuries. And one missing pebble, one man who didn't pass on his Y chromosome, leaves a stillness in the water, a silence. And those silences add up. Think of it this way. If each man represents a thread in a tapestry, then during this period, 19 out of every 20 threads were pulled loose, unraveling entire sections of the design. Some of those men may have died in raids, others in calculated exterminations. Some may have simply been outbred, clans with more power ensuring only their males had access to women, cutting everyone else off from reproduction altogether. Historians still debate the scale and cause of the bottleneck, but even the most conservative estimates agree. The decline in male genetic variance is undeniable, and it didn't happen over centuries. It happened in just a few dozen generations. That's fast. Too fast for coincidence, too sharp for drift. That's intent. You close your eyes and imagine a generation of young boys born into the wrong family, the wrong clan, the wrong side of a border. Their fate sealed before they even walked. Their bloodlines heading straight toward a dead end. And you, somehow, walked the other path. Your Y chromosome was one of the survivors. A statistical miracle. Not because of anything you did, but because someone long ago stayed alive long enough to pass it on. And that miracle, your very existence, sits beside 19 silences, 19 men who didn't make it. It's not just genetic. It's geographic, too. The grave sites, the pottery layers, the sudden absence of particular tool styles in certain regions, they all tell the same story. Cultures didn't just evolve. Some of them ended. And the cultures that replaced them, they didn't do it by accident. You lie back and let the wind hum through your ears like distant voices. Some of those voices were yours once, if your lineage had gone another way. The missing 19 may have laughed just like you, sat under stars just like you, held their children close, dreamt of next year's harvest. But history didn't make room for them. The record books never opened their names. The Y lines stopped. Their final contribution? To serve as contrast. A shadow that makes your light possible. So here you are, listening to something not quite a story, not quite a scream. Just absence. A presence made of lack. And in this moment of stillness, the world feels just quiet enough for you to finally hear it. You step into a room of flickering torchlight. Not a real place, but one conjured in the folds of your imagination. At the center stands a long wooden table, where archaeologists, anthropologists, and geneticists argue in low, serious voices. Charts spill across the table. Bones lie beside computers. DNA helixes twist on glowing monitors. And in the center of it all, that same question repeats like a heartbeat. Was it really a war? Because for all the evidence, the mass graves, the shattered skulls, the genetic bottleneck, there's still no smoking spear, no stone tablet that says, "On this day all the men were slain." No ancient battlefield memorializing the Great Purge. What you have instead is a mystery. A devastating, invisible catastrophe, seen only in numbers and bones. Historians still argue whether this was a true war, as we understand it today, or whether it was something subtler, something slower, something weirder. Maybe it was hundreds of small, tribal skirmishes, each one wiping out a little more male diversity, until one day, the entire continent's Y chromosome landscape had changed beyond recognition. Or maybe it wasn't war at all. Some suggest a reproductive arms race, not violent, not bloody, but cold and cruel. Powerful clans could have monopolized women, enforcing social hierarchies that prevented lesser males from reproducing entirely. You wouldn't need mass murder for that. Just enough social pressure, enough inequality, and the result could look almost identical. Imagine a Neolithic caste system. A handful of dominant males taking multiple wives, while lower status men live and die childless. The Y lines disappear not with screams, but with sighs. Some even propose a kind of genetic pyramid scheme, where a few successful male lineages spread so quickly that they simply drowned out the rest. No war, just relentless, overwhelming reproduction. But then, what do we make of the graves? Of the headless bodies at Schletz, the shattered skulls of Talheim, the bone-strewn pits of Herxheim? Sure, not every man was murdered, but enough were to raise a second possibility. What if it was both? What if the male extinction came through a combination of social dominance, cultural shifts, and periodic violence? A slow burn, punctuated by flash fires. You glance down at a map covered in pins and strings. Here, a mass grave. There, a genetic anomaly. Over there, a sudden rise in one patrilineal marker. It's like watching dominoes fall, not all at once, but with momentum. You lie still and try to imagine life in one of those early clans. You're a young man, maybe 18. You've just come of age, learned to farm, learned to throw a spear, learned to fear the men on the other side of the hill. Your elders tell you stories of past raids. Your older brother was killed last summer, and no one ever found his body. You know you won't inherit much. Your clan's leader has 5 sons already. The land is divided. The future is crowded. So you start to wonder, What if they disappeared? Not the leader, the other clan. What if their sons were no longer part of the equation? What if you and a few allies struck first? What if, when the dust settled, you had more wives, more land, more certainty? Not because you earned it, because you removed the competition. And maybe you weren't the first to think this way. Maybe someone tried it generations ago. And it worked. You wouldn't know their names, but you'd be living in the shadow of their strategy. That's how these things propagate. Not through instruction, but through imitation. Success breeds imitation. Imitation becomes culture. Culture becomes history. And history becomes invisible. Because the men who lived this story left no records. And the men who didn't survive never got the chance to tell theirs. So we piece together scraps. A femur here. A population graph there. A burial site that raises more questions than it answers. And we try to draw conclusions. But the truth is, we don't know. We don't know if the Y chromosome collapse was the result of deliberate, targeted extermination, or 1,000 slow reproductive dead ends. We don't know if the bodies in those pits died in rituals, ambushes, revenge killings, or famine-fueled panic. We don't know if this was war as we know it, or if it was something even more disturbing. A system. A quiet, unspoken system that emerged from new social structures, new ways of measuring worth, new ideas about who deserves to survive. You shift under your blanket and stare at the ceiling, feeling the weight of uncertainty settle like dust. Some nights, the not knowing is frustrating. But tonight, it's strangely soothing, because it means you get to imagine. It means the story isn't finished. It means that in some way, your quiet, curious mind is continuing a conversation that was never written down. You don't need to solve the mystery tonight. Just rest in it. Let it roll around in your thoughts like a smooth stone. Let it cradle you in its absence, like so many stories of prehistory do. It wasn't just about who lived. It was about who got remembered. And sometimes just asking why is its own kind of remembering. You're back at the edge of a burned-out village. Smoke curls into the sky. The smell of wet ash clings to your hair. But something's different this time. There's someone still standing. Not a warrior. Not a chief. A woman. She's barefoot. Her dress torn at the shoulder, her face blank, unreadable. Around her, the bodies of the men she once called brothers, fathers, sons, crumpled like broken tools in the dirt. She is alive, and she is the only one. This scene isn't hypothetical. It's echoed again and again in the archaeology. Sites like Talheim and Schletz contain a mix of male and female skeletons, but many show a higher ratio of dead men. In other cases, women and children are buried carefully, while the men lie broken and scattered. Why? Why would a massacre leave women standing? Historians still argue whether it was mercy, strategy, or something far more calculated. Because when you live in a society where land passes through fathers, when power is defined by male descent, killing the men doesn't just remove immediate resistance, it wipes the lineage clean. But sparing the women, that's where it gets complicated. You don't spare them because of kindness, you spare them because they're useful. In early farming societies, women were essential labor. They ground grain, wove textiles, raised children. And in a world where survival meant producing the next generation, women were the only route forward. You lie flat in the grass and imagine the calculation playing out in the mind of a prehistoric raider. We need food, we need land, we need sons. Kill the men, keep the women. It's not just conquest, it's assimilation. And for the women, What choice did they have? Their world was gone, their families erased. Their captors told them where to live, what to wear, who to bear children with. Over time, even their memories of home would be eroded, smoothed down like river stones until all that remained was survival. And perhaps silence. Historians have a word for this: gendered survival. It means women were sometimes spared, not for compassion, but for function. They weren't seen as threats. They were seen as infrastructure, as wombs, yes, but also as labor, as cultural clay to be reshaped and folded into the victor's world. You sit in a reconstructed Neolithic hut, low ceiling, clay walls, and watch as a woman kneels by the fire. Her children, fathered by someone she never chose, sit close to her side. She sings to them softly, not a song from her old village. That one is gone. This is a new song, taught by the woman next door, and the children will never know the difference. This is how cultures die, not with a bang, but with a lullaby. And over generations these women disappear from the record. Not physically, they're still there in the genes, still shaping the mitochondrial line. But their stories vanish. Their languages, their gods, their memories, replaced. They are the quietest survivors of prehistory, the most altered, the most unrecorded. Some anthropologists think this explains certain abrupt cultural shifts in pottery, clothing styles, even burial customs. Not because entire populations were wiped out, but because the men were, and the women were folded into someone else's way of life. Imagine a valley where everyone once worshipped the river. Then, a generation later, no one speaks of it anymore. The new clan worships the hills, and all the children do too. And the woman who once sang to the river doesn't speak up, because she's alone. You stare into a pool of water, dark and still, and think about what it means to survive a massacre. Not just to live, but to go on living in someone else's story, to carry the weight of your erased world on your back, and still have to grind grain each morning like nothing happened. And worse, to teach your children not to remember, not out of betrayal, but out of necessity. The archaeologists can't dig that up. There's no fossil record for suppressed memory, no artifact for cultural loss. But in your imagination, you can hear her voice. That woman, that first woman, the one who was spared. She's not grateful. She's numb. Historians still debate whether women were fully assimilated into new clans or held apart, whether they found space to influence their new world, or simply disappeared inside it. The answer is probably both. Some became mothers to powerful new sons. Others never bore children again. Some were honored, others enslaved. Most forgotten. But their bodies kept moving, kept surviving, kept singing new songs. You breathe slowly, letting that fact settle, that your own mitochondrial DNA might trace back to someone just like her. Someone who was spared not because she was valued, but because she was viable. And still, she endured. Still, she taught her children how to survive. Still, she helped build the world that came next, even if no one ever wrote down her name. So tonight, you remember her, not with a shrine, not with a speech, but with stillness, with silence, and with the quiet knowledge that the greatest acts of survival are often the least recorded. You sit beside a low, flickering fire, the smell of damp ash mixing with the sweetness of crushed grass. The smoke curls upward, spiraling into the night sky, just like the thoughts rising in your mind. Because now, we shift from bodies and bones to something even more powerful. Belief. Because before there were graves, there were grains. And these grains, they changed everything. The quiet culprits of this forgotten extinction weren't just stone axes and territorial raids. They were wheat, barley, millet, lentils, crops that seem harmless enough, humble little seeds in sun-baked soil. But in the right conditions, they grew more than food. They grew control. You walk through a Neolithic granary now, nothing but low clay walls and rodent-gnawed pits. But once, this place was the beating heart of a community, a storehouse of life, and just as often, a source of death. Because whoever held the grain, held the power. In earlier foraging societies, food was fluid, shared. There were no owners of the berries in the bush or the rabbit in the trap. But grain could be counted, measured, stored. Suddenly, food had borders, and borders need blades. Historians still debate whether agriculture was humanity's greatest mistake or its most necessary evil. But either way, once it began, there was no going back. The rise of farming created the first scarcity economies. If one harvest failed, you couldn't just follow a migrating herd. You were stuck, which meant your neighbor's surplus became your temptation, and your desperation became their threat. You remember what we talked about earlier, the rise of the patrilineal clan. That system didn't just evolve out of nowhere. It evolved because land and grain became valuable enough to defend with blood. You needed strong sons. You needed hard boundaries. You needed to know who would inherit the field, the tool, the name. Suddenly, land wasn't just land. It was a future, and people began to worship it. The gods, once carved in reindeer horn or whispered to in caves, took on new shapes. Fertility deities, earth mothers, grain spirits. Rituals formed around the planting and harvesting of crops. And slowly, agriculture wasn't just a way to survive. It was a belief system. But belief systems can justify anything. Imagine this. Your clan priest blesses the field before planting. He says the gods demand sacrifice. Not animals this time, not grain, but the enemy. A rival clan that doesn't honor the land the same way. A people who disrespect the field's sacred edge. And so you raid. You burn their granary. You take their women. You offer their blood to the soil. And when the crops grow tall, you whisper that the gods were pleased. Historians refer to this as ritualized violence, the merging of warfare and religion into something more permanent, more powerful, more accepted, and in many cases, more effective. You pass through a stone ring in the grass, what might have been a shrine, a council site, or a boundary marker. But in your mind's eye, it's so much more. You see painted faces, draped skins, hands raised, a child crying quietly behind a mother's legs. And somewhere, just out of view, a prisoner kneeling in the dirt. Because if violence becomes sacred, then no one's innocent. Herxheim may be the most disturbing example. Remember the hundreds of dismembered bodies, possibly processed for cannibalism. Some researchers believe that wasn't chaos. It was ceremony. And what's more disturbing, the victims weren't foreigners. They had the same pottery styles, the same tools. They were likely locals, neighbors, cousins, people who maybe failed to follow the rules, people who harvested too soon, or trespassed, or married the wrong person, or simply existed on the wrong side of the grain line. You lie flat in the grass and feel how soft the earth has become from millennia of ploughing and planting. Every handful is a time capsule, and every seed planted was once a wager: grow or starve, expand or be erased. No wonder people killed for it. Even now, the myth of the farmer as peaceful and passive lingers in our minds, but ancient farming societies were often more militarized than the hunters they replaced. It's easier to share a forest than it is to share a field. And once the crops came in, you had something to lose. And what you have, you fear losing. And what you fear losing, you fight to keep. You think of those early myths again. The corn gods, the harvest feasts, the blood rites, and the sun dances. Every culture built something sacred around food, because food was survival, and survival was war. So when you think of this great male extinction, not as a sudden massacre, but as a long economic collapse fueled by scarcity, belief, and inheritance, it starts to make sense. Maybe the real culprit wasn't violence. Maybe it was value. Once people valued land more than each other, the Y chromosomes started to fall, one by one. You roll over and see a stalk of grass silhouetted against the moon. Harmless, beautiful, and yet somewhere in your past, someone may have killed for it, died for it, built a monument or a myth around it, and buried someone beneath it. All so you could be here, lying in the future. The night has deepened now, the wind has calmed, and the fire inside your mind crackles low, casting soft shadows across a scene that's both impossibly distant and disturbingly intimate. You're no longer walking through Neolithic villages or crouching beside smouldering huts. You're sitting by a campfire, a real one, or imagined, and staring across the flames at the face of someone who lived, so you could live. Your ancestor. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. Because the story of what he did, or didn't do, is carved into your very cells, into your hands, your face, your breath. A single thin thread that survived where so many others were severed. You may never know his name. You may never know where he lived, or who he loved, or what he feared. But you do know one thing. He made it, and 19 others didn't. Tonight, we sit with that fact. We sit with the uncomfortable, unchangeable truth that you are here because something unthinkable happened. Not once, but across generations, across landscapes, across bloodlines. You exist because someone else didn't. It's not guilt, it's not pride, it's just genetic inheritance. Historians often call this the founder effect, when a single individual's descendants become dominant in a population simply because they were among the few who survived a bottleneck. Over time, their traits, whether good, bad, or neutral, become common. Not because they were superior, but because they were there when it mattered. It's humbling to realize that your eye color, your jawline, the way your hair grows, might trace back to the quirks of a man who slipped through the cracks of prehistory. Maybe he was clever, maybe he was lucky, maybe he was ruthless, maybe he just ran faster than the rest. You'll never know. But here's the strange part. It wasn't just his survival that shaped the future. It was the erasure of others. Whole clans, whole lineages, gone without a whisper. Their stories never told. Their traits never passed on. their fire snuffed out before they could cast a single shadow. You try to imagine them. The 19. Not faceless statistics, but real people. One may have been a brilliant flint napper. Another, a musician who made rhythms from bones. Another, the first in his clan to laugh after a hard winter. But they didn't make it. Their Y chromosomes stopped. Their sons were never born. Their campfires went cold. And your ancestor? He stayed warm. It's difficult to hold both truths at once, that you are the product of survival, and that survival often comes at a cost someone else paid. That's the quiet echo of this story. You are not descended from the strongest, or the smartest, or the kindest. You are descended from the survivors. And in prehistory, survival didn't always look noble. Sometimes it meant killing. Sometimes it meant fleeing. Sometimes it meant aligning with the right people at the right time. But always, it meant being there when everyone else wasn't. You stare into the fire again, and picture a fork in your ancestral path. One road leads to silence, one to breathe, one to you, lying here now. And when you look at modern populations, when scientists map the spread of Y chromosome haplogroups across continents, it becomes clear just how narrow that fork was. In parts of Asia, up to 8% of all men carry the same Y marker, traced to a single man, possibly Genghis Khan. In Europe, the dominance of haplogroups like R1b tells a story of post-Neolithic conquest and survival, of one patrilineage rising while others fell away. Every time the world restructured itself, a few men passed through, and the rest became footnotes. Or worse, not even that. And yet, you're not a relic. You're not a museum piece. You're proof that someone, somewhere, did whatever it took to keep the line going. And that means something, even if it's not clear what. You let the fire die down now, glowing coals reflecting in your eyes. Across from you, the shape of your imagined ancestor fades. Not in fear, not in pain, but in peace. His part is done. He got you here. And now it's up to you what happens next. Not in a dramatic sense, just in the soft, everyday choices. The stories you choose to carry, the silences you choose to remember, the bones you choose to treat not as artifacts, but as echoes of people who once sat by fires just like this one. People who wanted to live, people who didn't, people who couldn't, and people who somehow did. You walk now through a field where the earth has finally stopped bleeding. No more pits, no more ash, just quiet. The wind brushes past your face like a sigh of relief after a long, fevered dream. Something has changed. The killing has slowed. Not because humanity has suddenly become enlightened, but because something unexpected has taken root beside the wheat and barley. Complexity, trade, cooperation, storytelling, shared gods. These things begin to weave together into something more resilient than conquest alone. The old system of annihilation and replacement, of wiping out rival patrilineages, begins to falter under the weight of new tools. Language, diplomacy, memory. Historians still argue whether this transition was inevitable or accidental. But sometime around 4,500 to 3,000 BCE, the frequency of mass graves and male-targeted erasures begins to drop. Slowly, unevenly, but measurably. The maps of mass violence thin. The genetic cliff begins to level out. Humanity stabilizes. You stand at the crossroads of that transformation. One road still paved with sharpened flint and smoke-blackened timbers. The other, newer path lined with simple market stalls, clay tokens, shared rituals. The world doesn't become peaceful overnight, but it becomes too entangled to collapse in the same old way. Because now, not every village is isolated. Now, people need each other. A clan with too much salt begins trading with a clan with too much grain. A young man from one tribe marries a woman from another, not by force, but by alliance. Children speak both dialects. Suddenly the lines of descent blur, rivalries soften, kinship spreads sideways instead of only down. It doesn't always work. The old instincts still flare up. Wars still happen. But they're no longer designed to erase lineages. They're fought for resources, for power, for pride, but not to scrub a surname from existence. You lie back beneath a wide sky and feel the tension ease, like a long-held breath finally exhaled. In Mesopotamia, the first cities begin to rise. Uruk, Eridu. In the Indus Valley, grids of baked bricks appear. In Egypt, the Nile feeds vast harvests, not clan rivalries. These aren't utopias, but they are something new. Civilization. And civilization complicates violence. In a city, you can't kill everyone who disagrees with you. You need neighbors. You need scribes. You need stable relationships. You need priests and brewers and midwives and guards. The old formula, kill the men, take the women, doesn't fit anymore. The groups are too big, too intertwined. Bloodlines no longer function like fragile threads. They tangle, loop, bind, and survive in unexpected ways. Anthropologists call this the threshold of scale. A tipping point where the old systems, tribal raids, male-targeted exterminations, patrilineal purges, stop being efficient. The world becomes too big, too crowded, too interconnected to make extinction a viable tactic. You hear it in the language too. Words shift, concepts emerge. Words like treaty, cousin, neighbor, and eventually history. And with history comes something else. Accountability. Because once stories are written, the past starts to matter. Once you can record a conflict, you also remember its consequences. You carry forward lessons. You question motives. You build myths, but also memories. And memory tempers violence in a way that fire never could. You smile at the idea of two rival chiefs sitting under a linen canopy, arguing about oxen while scribes take notes. 10 generations ago, one would have burned the other's village. Now, they bicker over grain weights. Progress. Not perfect, but real. Historians still argue over what caused the decline in prehistoric male-targeted violence. Was it trade? Shared religion? Climate change forcing cooperation? Or simply the fact that, as populations grew, the cost of extermination outweighed the benefits? Whatever the cause, the trend is clear. By the Bronze Age, the bottleneck has passed. The Y chromosome begins to recover. Male genetic diversity slowly increases. The survivors of the purge are no longer fighting to preserve their lone branch. They're adding new ones. The tree grows again. You walk through a city market now, not paved in stone, but packed dirt beneath reed awnings. People barter. Children chase dogs. A woman scolds her husband. A potter grumbles about prices. And for the first time, you see something that feels familiar. Not war, not ritual, but normalcy. You realize peace isn't born from enlightenment, It's born from exhaustion. The world finally grew tired of erasing itself, and that exhaustion made room for everything we now recognize as culture, poetry, marriage, music, storytelling, bureaucracy, boredom, even sleep, especially sleep. You lie beneath a woven mat, hearing the city hum outside, a drumbeat somewhere distant, laughter, voices, life continuing without fear of erasure. The nightmare is not over, but it's changed form, and for the first time in this long, haunted journey through prehistory, you feel something new stirring in your chest. Not fear, not survival, but continuity. You're lying still now, under the soft glow of a prehistoric moon, watching the flickering shadows dance on a cave wall that hasn't heard a human voice in thousands of years. Your eyes are heavy, your thoughts drift like embers. But before you sleep, there's one last thing to understand. You are the product of a forgotten war, not a war of empires, not of generals and soldiers. A war without names or treaties or dates to mark its beginning or end. It left no monuments, no epic poems, no battlefields preserved for tourists. And yet it may have shaped you more than anything that came after, because it happened not in cities, but in clans, not on maps, but in DNA. It was a war fought not for ideology, but for continuity. And somehow, through luck or brutality or quiet persistence, you are one of the sons who made it through. You trace your finger through the dust beside you and imagine a line, one continuous thread stretching backward through the fog. Your father's 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 father, on and on, unbroken, past the Bronze Age, past the first cities, past even the first wheel, back to someone who should not have survived, someone whose 19 brothers or cousins or neighbors did not. You try to picture him. He's not remarkable, just a man. Calloused hands, crooked teeth, maybe a scar across his cheek, maybe a fire in his belly, maybe just fear and timing. But he lived. He had a son, and that son had another. And eventually you were born. That's the thing about survival. It isn't noble. It isn't fair. It isn't deserved. It just is. And the world is built by the ones who simply keep going. You close your eyes and feel the presence of those who didn't. The 19. You never knew them, but your body did. Your bloodline passed by their graves. Your Y chromosome stepped over their broken bones and kept moving. That's not guilt. It's not triumph either. It's just truth. You are a genetic ghost story, walking in the flesh. A reminder that history doesn't always leave records. It leaves silences. And those silences whisper louder than any monument. Your body holds the memory of every forked path where a different ancestor might have failed. And every one of those failures cleared a road for you. That's heavy, but not hopeless. Because it means that even now, every moment you breathe is another ripple in that old, quiet war. A war that's long over. A war no one remembers. A war that ended not in victory, but in persistence. And so here you are, tucked under a blanket, listening, remembering something you never knew, thinking about a world that no longer exists, a war that left no name, a silence filled only by your own heartbeat. You are the last son of that war. And now, that war is over. Let it be over. Let yourself rest. Let the 19 finally lie in peace. Let the fields grow again. Let the axe stay buried beneath the grain. Let the names forgotten stay soft in the soil where they belong. And you, let yourself be carried into sleep by the simple miracle of still being here. Let the story fade like mist in the morning. Let the silence close around you like a blanket. Let it end. The fire has gone out now. The air is cooler, softer. Even the trees seem to breathe slower. You lie still, your body heavy in the most peaceful way. The kind of weight that says, it's safe now. You don't need to run. You don't need to fight. You don't need to remember anything else tonight. You've traveled far, through time, through soil, through silence, from the shadows of forgotten men to the quiet resilience of those who survived. You've listened to bones, to wind, to data, to whispers carried by firelight. And now, you can let go of it all. No need to carry their stories any longer. You've honored them simply by remembering. That's enough. You've given them a name, even if it's only in your dreams. Your breathing slows. Your mind unwinds. The words stretch out into silence, soft and warm, like a blanket tucked beneath your chin. There's nothing more you need to do. Nothing to fix, nothing to solve. Just rest. Let your thoughts drift gently, like smoke rising from an ancient hearth. Let yourself sink, softly, into the earth of sleep. You're safe. You're still. You're here. Good night.